I've been meaning to submit this story to you for a while now. I don't have many scary memories or stories, but there's one that always stuck with me ever since I was a little kid, which is when this happened. I can't remember what state we even lived in at the time, but I know we lived in a small town that felt kind of quaint and pleasant to me. Primera was probably 3 or 4 when this all happened, so obviously my memories are a bit hazy on the details. But the main plot of the story, I definitely remember it perfectly. I attended this kindergarten in town. It was a pretty small one with maybe 15 little kids, and it was basically what you'd expect. A corner for toys, crappy art on the walls, nap time, a little recess in the yard, and the absolute typical kindergarten. And it would have been completely normal, except for the fact that, from day one of me attending that school, there was this one strange kid, and we'll just call her Annabelle. She wouldn't join in with the class. She wouldn't read aloud or paint or come outside for recess. She wouldn't do anything except sit in the corner, which everyone referred to as Annabelle's corner. And she didn't just sit there either. No? She sat there making little figures out of Play-Doh and then smashing them with her little fist over and over. Or sometimes she'd pull the limbs off, and then the head. Sometimes she'd lie them down and slowly roll the little plastic rolling pin over them. Either way, the end result was that she repeatedly made these Play-Doh people came to a very sticky end. And from the day I arrived at the kindergarten, I started in the middle of the year, because we just moved to the state. The teachers had already taken to ignoring Annabelle and just letting her do what she wanted. She wasn't causing any harm or hurting anyone after all. Naturally, none of the other kids were friends with her. Maybe they tried back in the day, but as far as I knew, they all just ignored the creepy girl in the corner and her Play-Doh playtime. Now, I had a cousin with Down syndrome, and while I could see that Annabelle didn't have Downs, I got it into my head that she had some kind of condition, and it was my duty to befriend her and be nice to her. And so, after a couple of weeks of attending the kindergarten and a few more days of building up the confidence, I approached Annabelle in her corner. I was ready for her to just hiss at me or act hostile or ignore me altogether. What I didn't expect was for her to greet me with this big smile, introducing herself and asking me to sit down and suggest that we become best friends. And yet, that's exactly what happened as a little kid. I remember being slightly taken aback. But hey, this was exactly what I'd wanted, right? So, I introduced myself too, and sat down, and almost immediately, as if she assumed it's what I wanted, Annabelle began showing me how to make the Play-Doh figurines, and the various ways in which I could crush them. She didn't explain why we were doing any of this. It was like she figured that I already knew, but she had some particular instructions on how to make what I assumed to be random humanoids. This one had to be short. This one had to have a big nose, and this one needed some big old ears. And it soon became clear that we were making figures of both children and adults. And I'd say that there were maybe an 80-20th split between kids and grown-ups. Now, I went along with this for days because I was just happy that I'd managed to become Annabelle's friend out of all the kids in class. And it took a while for me to ask why we were doing this and what all this Play-Doh violence was for. And the answer Annabelle gave was not something I'd ever heard of before. It was voodoo. She told me a little kid was talking about voodoo. Now, I'd just like to add here that Annabelle was a Caucasian blonde kid, and as far as I know, she wasn't from anywhere that really practiced voodoo or any sort of religion like that. And I am as convinced as I can possibly be that this wasn't some cultural thing, and that she'd heard about the concept from one of her older brothers, of which she had 3, 2 of whom were into horror movies and all sorts of weird stuff like that. And I say this very non-judgmentally, because obviously as a Let's Read fan I am too. And Annabelle explained what voodoo was to me, which I won't bother recounting because you all know what it is. But the key part here was that we were making these little effigies of our classmates and teachers, and one day, if we were lucky, the gods of voodoo would smile down on us and cause our actions against the dolls to be transferred to the person they represented. I asked Annabelle why we'd even want to do this. Why did we want to hurt our classmates and teachers? And she just looked at me like I was some idiot, actually rolling her eyes, and said something like, "Because they're awful, you dummy." I didn't really agree, but the look on Annabelle's face made me feel like I really shouldn't voice that disagreement. Once she explained everything to me, I found out that one of the kids were regularly making dolls of what was another girl who we'll just call Kirsty. Kirsty was popular. Kind of. Braithy and I guess I can see why Annabelle disliked her even though we were just little kids. And the more Annabelle opened up to me too, the more I became to understand her. It seemed like when she first joined kindergarten, the other kids had actually bullied her a bit. I only know this now as an adult, but there was this whole thing with Annabelle's family where they were regarded as paras in the town unfairly for reason I won't get into. And so the kindergarten teachers had never really bothered to put a stop to the torment. Instead, Annabelle had found out about voodoo one day, and that's what set her on this path. Primera, why se torn? I didn't agree that any of the people really deserved to be dismembered or smashed or squished by gods, but I felt sorry for Annabelle, too. So I just kind of humored her. And then one day, I noticed Kirsty hadn't been in class for a couple of days. And then the teacher took us aside and told us the bad news in as sensitive a way as you really could. Kirsty had something called leukemia, a rare kind, and it was very likely that she wouldn't be coming back to school, and we might not see her again. They didn't explain the concept of death to us exactly, and at least in the way that I remember it, that they didn't handle it very well. But the short version is, they told us Kirsty was dying of leukemia. And to me, who didn't really understand how these things work, it felt like it had struck her out of nowhere. Obviously, you can see where my brain went as a kid. One of the gods of voodoo had smiled upon us and given Kirsty leukemia thanks to all the voodoo dolls that we kept making her out of that Play-Doh. And to me, Annabelle and I had effectively sentenced someone to death. And then the next week, my most disliked teacher, Mrs. Molly, slipped in the recess yard and broke her leg. We made voodoo dolls of her a lot, too. I liked making those because they were big fat dolls and they were fun to smash and smush and squash, and I didn't like them anymore. Toe. I mulled over everything in my head for a few days. I was the kind of kid who built up internalized trauma real easy. I have no idea why. My parents weren't all that strict, and I'd never really been in trouble for anything. But I would feel sick with guilt for days or weeks over the dumbest thing. For example, thinking a swear word silently in my head. And eventually I'd either move on from it or confess it to my mom, who would inevitably just tell me not to worry about it. Now this time, though, I was certain that I was right to worry about it. And I didn't think it was my mom that I needed to confess to, but our main kindergarten teacher. And so on recess, I went inside and told her everything, how me and Annabelle had making voodoo dolls. And that we given Kirsty leukemia. And then we hadn't stopped there, and we broken Mrs. Me's leg. Now, here's where I think the teacher really messed up, whose name I genuinely forget despite how many years I'd spent angry at her. Now, she must have been able to tell that I was sincere. Say, most have. I was crying and struggling to get the words out. I was clearly having a really hard time. But instead of gently explaining to me that this isn't how things work, that you can create voodoo dolls out of Play-Doh and give classmates sicknesses, and that you can't make Miss Molly break her leg, this teacher screamed at me. She told me I was disrespecting Kirsty and Mrs. Me and that I was being a horrible little child, and she was seriously considering calling my parents in. I think the only reason she didn't was because she knew that she'd handled that badly, and she shouldn't have let her anger control how she reacted to me. Now, of course, this all made me feel really, totally awful. So I vented to my only friend, Annabelle, and then, as soon as I realized I just admitted to Annabelle that I'd ratted her out as well. And so then I started apologizing deeply for that too. And Annabelle just sat there in silence for a while like she was thinking really hard. I kept talking, suggesting that maybe we should just make a voodoo doll of the teacher, because the gods would definitely smile on us this time. And eventually Annabelle just shook her head and asked me if I really was sorry that I tried to rat her out. Now, repeatedly, I insisted. I told her I'd do anything to prove it. In a city where time is the only currency that matters, millions of souls race against a clock that never stops. Among them was Julian, a man who measured his worth by the speed of his success. Julian was always running toward his next meeting, running away from his own Julian was always running toward his next meeting, running away from his own shadow, convinced that every second not spent building his empire was a second wasted. But at the very heart of the chaos, there was a pocket of stillness. An old man named Elias sat on a weathered wooden bench, surrounded by the soft flutter of pigeon wings. Julian, blinded by his own momentum, didn't see the man. He only saw an obstacle. A sudden collision sent Julian's briefcase skidding across the cobblestones. Frustrated, Julian began to snout. Elias looked at him with a gaze that seemed to see right through his expensive suit and into his hollow chest. Without a word of apology, Elias reached into his pocket and, "Take this," Elias whispered. He shoved the trinket into his pocket, but something was different. Every time Julian brushed past someone in distress, a co-worker crying in the hall, a janitor struggling with a heavy cart, the compass in his pocket would burn. He sat at the head of a boardroom table. He pulled the compass out. The needle wasn't pointing to. Suddenly, the boardroom felt like a cage. Julian stood up mid-sentence, ignoring the confused stares of his partners, and ran. He ran, not toward a goal, but toward a feeling. Outside, the weather had turned. A cold rain began to slick the streets, turning the city into a gray labyrinth. Julian followed the compass's glow through the mist. In the corner of a quiet park, he found the source of the compass's pool. A small child sat alone on a swing, sobbing quietly, lost in the vastness of the city. Outside, the weather had turned. A cold rain began to slick the streets, turning the city into a gray labyrinth. Julian followed the compass's glow through the mist. In the corner of a quiet park, for the first time in years, Julian stopped checking he helped the child find their frantic parents nearby. As the family reunited, the overwhelming noise of the city seemed to fade into a peaceful silence. Julian realized that his pursuit of success was a race with no finish line. He had been so busy making a living that he had forgotten how to make a life. The next morning, the city square was as busy as ever. Julian returned to the wooden bench, hoping to find the old man and thank him, but the seat was empty. The next morning, the city square was as busy as ever. Julian returned to the wooden bench, hoping to find the old man and thank him, but the seat was empty. Elias was gone, but he looked at the compass one last time. The best use of